Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for yet another very interesting interview. I'm Patricia Kovacevic, General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at Nicopure Labs. I'm here today with Jeff Stier, who's a Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. He is the head of the Risk Analysis Division and also a non-practicing attorney.
Happily non-practicing attorney.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We're here to talk about the recent U.S. Surgeon General report and a couple of other developments regarding the vaping industry. As you all know, a few weeks ago, the U.S. Surgeon General has published its report on electronic cigarettes, and some of the conclusions drawn in that report are concerning. In your opinion, Jeff, what is the significance of this report, and what can you tell us about the timing of it?
Well, it wasn't simply a report by the Surgeon General. It was a Surgeon General's report, which has historical significance because in 1964, the Surgeon General released a report on smoking, and that was a very important and bold document at a time when people didn't know that smoking was harmful. This Surgeon General's report on vaping and youth, is actually not only doesn't only lack the bold approach of that original Surgeon General's report, it's actually purposefully misleading because it only focuses on youth. And there is no controversy in the scientific community, in the vaping community, anywhere. Kids shouldn't use e-cigarettes, whether they have nicotine or not, period, end of story. There is no controversy. The Surgeon General didn't solve any problems. His report only confused people by suggesting e-cigarettes are so dangerous and such a problem when we know kids shouldn't be using them. And the real area where the public needs more information and more education is how can e-cigarettes be used, if at all, to reduce harm from smoking. The Surgeon General would have been wise to follow the report of Public Health England, the largest landmark government study on the issue to date, which of course said kids shouldn't use e-cigarettes, but talked about how they are a potential boon to public health. The Royal College of Physicians, similarly, also way ahead of the Surgeon General, obviously agreed kids shouldn't use e-cigarettes, but the Royal College of Physicians suggested doctors encourage their patients who smoke to quit smoking using e-cigarettes because they can help people reduce their risk. They're 95% less harmful than smoking, and they're not a gateway to smoking. So the Surgeon General, who claimed he had 2 years of work on this, had 150 or more experts advising him, seemed to only be able to focus on an area where there is no debate.
Furthermore, legislation at state level and now at federal level since the deeming rule, in fact, bans the sales of vaping products to minors. And we know that FDA, in fact, has done some work in enforcement in the area of retail, age verification, and sales to minors. So clearly, that is the premise that the industry, as well as public health, start from. Kids should not have access to nicotine-containing products, which is clear. But what this report seems to fail to address is, in fact, by omission, the true value that these products could present in harm reduction. And it also fails to address what basically FDA is doing to really protect kids from the dangers of smoking.
Well, that's an important point. I think that shows the fact that the Surgeon General only looked at youth use and didn't get into the potential benefits of e-cigarettes as a tool for harm reduction to get adult smokers not to smoke anymore. I think the fact that he only focused on the Surgeon General, focused on youth and vaping, is because this is part of a Centers for Disease Control ideological campaign against e-cigarettes. And instead of giving us a full picture and a full story, he focused only on youth because it's very clear you can't say much bad about e-cigarettes and adult smokers. We want them to switch. So this is the reason he only focused on kids was because this Surgeon General's report, which a Surgeon General's report is supposed to mean something, was being used as a political tool to advance the Obama administration campaign against e-cigarettes, to support the FDA's deeming regulation, to support the Center for Disease Control campaign against e-cigarettes. I think this was a parting shot from the Obama administration's Surgeon General.
And what measures should the new administration take in order to at least mitigate some of the communication damage that this U.S. Surgeon General report has, in fact, accomplished?
Well, first and foremost, the Surgeon General has a 4-year term. He was appointed 2 years ago, so he's got about another 2 years left in his term. Yet, the Surgeon General can be fired by the president for cause, for doing something wrong, for not doing his job right. I will argue that, and I will argue in the upcoming administration, that this report is cause. This report proves that the Surgeon General has been acting in a political way, and the Office of Surgeon General was supposed to be above politics. And this report, unfortunately, shows that he was just, this Surgeon General was a supporter of President Obama before he was appointed Surgeon General. He was actually an activist in favor of President Obama, supporting his ideological campaigns. And this shows that the new administration needs to fire this Attorney General, this Surgeon General, and we know he likes firing people apparently, but this is an opportunity for the administration to say, we're going to put the politics of this aside and get a fresh start with Surgeon General. There's a lot the new administration can do. That may require 5 more podcasts. But with regard to the Surgeon General, he hasn't done much. He did this, and he shouldn't keep his job.
More importantly, if you go to the Surgeon General's webpage, there is an infographic that if you're not a vapor, if you're not really very familiar with vaping and you're a smoker and perhaps want to quit, if you go through that click-through webpage, through talking about children mainly, but you would, I think, reach the conclusion that vaping is outright dangerous, should be avoided at any costs, and it's a gateway to a lot of other really bad forms of addiction. Is there really any evidence to that?
I think we could all agree, while we could quibble with some of the science and some of the strength of the science behind it, we could all agree unequivocally that kids should not use e-cigarettes whether they have nicotine in them or they don't. The Surgeon General, of course, pointed out that nicotine is bad for the developing brain. I don't think anyone's going to disagree that kids unquestionably, without any hesitation, should never use any e-cigarette product. But to kind of say that e-cigarettes are so bad because of the nicotine, apparently even for adults, then that raises questions. Why should someone quit smoking and switch to e-cigarettes if they're also really bad? So the government's approach, and for the new administration, my advice, is to treat different products according to their risk. Focus on adult smokers, give them the information based on science that they need to make informed decisions about their health and about the choices they make. That's the only way to get people to change behavior, is to give them information where they can make decisions on their own. I don't know of any kids who are going to quit smoking because of the Surgeon General's report on smoking, or I don't know any kids who are going to quit vaping if they vape based on the Surgeon General's report. We need to give people accurate, science-based information so they can make informed decisions. And the Surgeon General instead focused on politics.
And did a great disservice, in fact, to public health through this reckless report, if you say
Yeah,
so.
and it was also a missed opportunity because there is one Surgeon General's report on smoking. There is one, you update it, there is one Surgeon General's report on vaping. This report was a huge missed opportunity to have a little bit of nuance. I think with the budget he has, with 2 years to work on it, and with over 150 experts, he could have given us that more nuanced report and say, vaping is bad for kids shouldn't do it, and then talk about the opportunities to dispel some of the misinformation. So many Americans still think, wrongly obviously, so many Americans still think that smoking and vaping are equally dangerous. If the Surgeon General is to do anything, it is to add a little bit of science to the discussion about this and explain how dangerous cigarette smoking is, why it's so dangerous, and then it's easy to conclude that the use of e-cigarettes by adult smokers can dramatically reduce their risk, just as the Royal College of Physicians and Public Health England have been telling people based on the science.
On the heels of the U.S. Surgeon General report, only days after, a new report came out, Monitoring the Future, which discusses trends in teenage use of different addictive substances. And interestingly, the numbers in that report tell an interesting story.
Yeah, and this is a National Institutes of Drug Abuse funded study at the University of Michigan that has been reporting every year, every 2 years on the use of tobacco products, on the use of also e-cigarettes. I still refuse to call them tobacco products. And in previous years, it showed an increase in the use of e-cigarettes among youth. Now, obviously, there's been an increase in the use of e-cigarettes among youth over the past 5 years. because there was no popularity of these products. That's like saying
they didn't exist 7-8 years ago.
That's like saying the use of iPhones has gone up 100% in the last 4 years, 6 years. Well, when you go back 10 years, there were no iPhones. So of course, the numbers have gone up. But interestingly, Patricia, this year, the use of e-cigarettes among teens has gone down. And while the amount of e-cigarette use was going up over time among kids, even though this year it went down, while that number was going up, it is interesting that their smoking rates went down
All along.
during that time period. Now, is it possible that kids who were on a trajectory to begin smoking, actually, instead of using e-cigarettes as a gateway towards smoking, actually used them as an off-ramp to smoking and didn't smoke as a result of e-cigarettes? That's something that the report didn't draw a conclusion about in previous years. This year, e-cigarette use among teens went down. I think that's significant, and I think it takes away from the argument that the Surgeon General made in his report, which was that we ought to have sin taxes on e-cigarettes to keep kids from vaping, because, he argued, there's been this huge increase. Well, now there is not an increase, there's actually a decrease. I don't think the Surgeon General is going to change his opinion on that, because it wasn't based on science, it was based on ideology. But I think it's important to note that this report, which was written by these experts at University of Michigan, no friends of vaping, came out the way it did.
But at the end of the report, in spite of the numbers showing a downwards trend in electronic cigarettes and the downwards trend even in smoking, and to follow up on what you said, as a cohort, you would have expected to see maybe an uptick in smoking if truly e-cigarettes were a gateway. However, in spite of these reassuring numbers, one of the authors of the report, the lead author, actually drew a very puzzling conclusion.
Yeah, well, he said, and this is in the press release, and this is common. You know, I deal with a wide range of public health policy topics, not just e-cigarettes. Public health, food safety, nutrition, obesity, environmental health. And one thing that I see all the time is a scientific report that reaches a certain conclusion, and then a press release that draws entirely new conclusions that I'm not sure where they got them from. This is sadly a very good example of it. The lead author of the scientific report said, quoted in the University of Michigan press release, something along the lines of, well, vaping may cause social networks that people will become friends from vaping, and then they could eventually go on to smoke. So vaping's a problem. Excuse me?
It would be very difficult to come to an actual scientific conclusion based on data that simply asks people, how much do you vape, maybe where you vape, and so on. It would be very difficult to draw those conclusions.
So I think the one conclusion that you could draw is that the lead author of this report is not a friend of vaping. Yet even his own study tells us that youth vaping rates have gone down. To me, that totally takes away any argument that the Surgeon General has to back up his political claim that we ought to be taxing e-cigarettes. And by the way, for the Surgeon General in a scientific report to be making these types of policy recommendations raises questions, but let's leave that aside. The basis for that political argument that we should have e-cigarette taxes to prevent teen use, justified by the fact that teen use has gone up, that's no longer there anymore. So the new administration is going to have to take a fresh look at this, take a fresh look at all of the science done by the Obama administration, and actually look to people who have been doing the science, looking at the actual data, looking at U.S. exposure, U.S. use, and looking at other countries, such as England, where they actually have good science, backed up by data, where you actually have significant numbers of people quitting smoking, as we do in the U.S., and then actually turn that into the science to make good policy on it. And we're not doing that here in the U.S. Maybe things will change.
We hope so. Another surprising fact for all of us in the industry, when we see these kind of statements, who really holds their feet to the fire when a scientist makes a statement that is completely unfounded, or even when people announcing the deeming rule stated that it was the most revolutionary act to protect the children from nicotine, and in fact the only child-friendly provision in the deeming rule is the age verification provision. How can people get away with saying things that are not supported by science and that are really purely speculative, and nobody really calls them onto that? What should be done?
You know, I asked this very question to Mitch Zeller, the head of tobacco control at the FDA, at a conference where he was celebrating, ironically, I believe it was 2 years ago, at the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Surgeon General's report. They had held a big event to say what a great thing they had done. And Mitch Zeller was there to celebrate it. And the head of or the former head of the Tobacco Product Scientific Advisory Committee was there. And he had said in a report published, I believe, in a California newspaper, that we're worried about nicotine. We're worried about nicotine because not only can you become addicted to it by smoking or using e-cigarettes, but if there's nicotine on the upholstery, then through exposure to the skin, your body can absorb nicotine, and even if you're not a nicotine user, you can become addicted to nicotine. It's such an absurd argument, not backed up by any science. And I had this opportunity where Mitch Zeller was standing next to, at a press conference, the person who was quoted as saying that. And I took the opportunity to ask the scientist who said that, or at least was quoted as saying that in the newspaper, was that a misquote? I'm hoping that was a misquote. And he said, no, well, it's fact. There's science that if nicotine and dermal exposure through the skin, somehow that got him to reach that conclusion. And I was giving him the opportunity to say, no, I was misquoted. And he doubled down, Patricia. He said, no, it can happen. And then I had the opportunity to look Mitch Zeller in the eye and say, as a scientist who is affiliated with the FDA, I know it's your job as a regulatory agency to crack down on industry if they say anything unscientific. Does the FDA have an obligation to tell the public that if there is scientific misinformation, certainly from one of its TPSAC members, from a scientist that the FDA engages with, does the FDA have an obligation to correct the record and tell us that, no, you can't become addicted to nicotine through a couch? And he looked at me in the eye and he said, our role at the FDA is to have authority over the industry. Congress gave us that authority, and that is our obligation.
So in other words, they have authority over the industry, but not over the Tobacco Product Scientific Advisory Committee, whom FDA appoints.
Nor does the FDA recognize that it has an obligation to actually give science-based information to the public. Look, the industry is not allowed to talk about lower-risk products without going through all the FDA approval processes. The industry can't make a low-risk claim. If there are government officials, if there are respected scientists saying this in the media, if the industry can't do it, I was asking Mitch Zeller, well, doesn't the FDA see as its obligation to correct the record, to make sure that people can make informed decisions about the choices they make? Apparently not. That leaves it to your viewers, Patricia. That leaves it to the people watching this video to educate themselves and to engage in the process, because industry can't do it, and the FDA has stated it won't do it. It's up to the people to engage, to educate themselves, and then to actually recognize that the obligation is on them. Don't count on industry, and don't count on the FDA.
In all fairness to Mr. Zeller, he did state on numerous occasions that nicotine is not the problem, and he even conceded that to the individual, switching to a product such as vaping would be beneficial to the individual, him or herself, but didn't really go further. And in fact, that in itself was always quantified or qualified by a statement about public impact of use of nicotine products, where really the waters are going to be muddled inevitably because there are so many patterns of use, dual use, switching back, relapse, and so on. So of course, time will tell what truly the population level impact will be of these products, but there are really no indications that the trends are not there to show this immense uptake in smoking or some other bad influences of or results
or increased
of
nicotine
vaping.
use overall. No, it's not there.
Right.
But I would make the point that, you correctly pointed out that Mitch Zeller has talked about the fact that the danger of smoking is not from the nicotine, it's from the use of combustible tobacco. He has said that. But then he has said that, if that's the case, then why are these deeming regulations so bad? He has said that Congress gave him a certain authority, and he has to regulate within the authority given to him by Congress. We can disagree with his interpretation, but if that's the FDA's interpretation of the law, well, then there's a fix. There are two possible fixes. One, through litigation, which your company has boldly been out in front of, and two, change the law. We don't need bad policy. If we have laws that give us bad policy, we can challenge those laws in court if the law is not being applied right, or if the law is being applied right, if the court says, no, the FDA is doing just fine, then we can change the law. The only way we can change the law is if the people engage, if the people go out and vote and make sure they have people elected that can change the law. A lot of that's been done. I think now it's up to the people to educate the people they elected to make sure that the laws are changed in a way that protects public health, that gives people a choice, information to make informed decisions. It's not going to happen on its own. It's not, let's sit back and wait. The only way to do it is to educate yourself, to speak out, and then to actually get involved and do it. Because I guarantee you the FDA isn't interested in promoting harm reduction.
It does not appear so, at least from some of their statements. More importantly, also Mitch Zeller said that this is not a spectator sport and everybody has to get in the ring, and we agree with that. We do see an opportunity now with the new administration. Hopefully in one of our future webinars we'll talk about what are the options. As a conclusion, what do you see a timeline more or less for more aggressive communication on the side of the government on this issue? What would be, in an ideal world, with a new FDA commissioner in place, what should they change? And I'm not talking discrete, rules or regulations, but what should they change in their approach to really truly serve public health with respect to this issue, the opportunity presented by vaping products versus conventional smoking?
Well, I think the FDA by law has freedom to share scientific information with the public. I think the FDA needs to re-engage on the deeming regulations. And many times we see regulatory agencies lobby Congress to change the law because it feels like it doesn't have enough power, it feels like the law restrains them too much. I think the new FDA needs to go back to Congress and say, this law that you gave us, that the FDA has been implementing, not such a good law. It wasn't really written for e-cigarettes. It didn't have harm reduction in mind. And the agency, and the agency doesn't like to admit this unless it's lobbying, the agency has the authority, has the ability to go back to Congress and say, our authority should be changed, and educate Congress about how that authority should be changed. So I believe that the FDA should take a proactive approach to harm reduction. If there are any laws that limit the administration's ability to advance public health, then it needs to fix the law. And the agency can be, the new administration can use its ability to educate the public and to educate Congress to advance a harm reduction approach. And I believe that the new administration should, and optimistically, I believe they will do that.
Very well. And of course, we all know that changing the law takes bipartisan support, and it takes a long time. There are, of course, many priorities in our Senate and Congress for sure. In the meantime, however, of course, FDA can exercise enforcement discretion on a number of provisions of the deeming rule, which also would be an avenue that is more immediate. FDA exercises enforcement discretion all the time on a number of matters in their regulated products. Time will tell. Of course, we will continue to keep you updated on all developments. Just recently, we also saw that FDA already extended some deadlines that were stipulated in the deeming rule, and that is a positive sign that they understand how onerous the compliance is for the small, in particular the small players in the industry. Thank you very much for your time. We really hope to see you back in a few months, and we hope to be able to discuss the new administration and its impact on public health and on FDA as it pertains to vaping.
Thank you for having me on, Patricia.
Looking forward to having you as our guests for a future webinar, and thank you very much for your continued attention.